Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to MHVR Bytes. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Adam Baldowski.
And I am Dr. Jessica Stone, and we are so excited to have Dr. Gurr here with us today. We don't do a big formal bio. I'm going to let you have a chance to explain a little bit who you are. Even if I tried to do a bio for you, you've been involved in so many different aspects of working in VR and mental health that I think the bio would be extremely long. So I'm excited to hear more about that during this hour. I will say that for me, this is really exciting because I don't even know exactly how many years it's been, but I feel like 10, maybe even more, that we have had very sporadic emails, even when you were starting to bring together people who were utilizing VR in a clinical sense. And so hearing now, all these years later, getting to meet and then hearing more about what you're currently doing is gonna really be exciting for me. So what would you like to share with our audience that you can pick out of your very vast experience?
Well, thank you for that introduction. Glad to be here. I guess I get very humble in the sense that I see myself just as somebody who's a clinician who believes that technology should be in private practice, and we should be using what's available to us to make therapy more efficient and help people get through their difficulties faster. And so that's kind of like the beginning for me for everything, in the sense that I was always trying to find what would make therapy from either the patient side or even the clinician side more efficient. And so I can go back and talk about how in 1990 I computerized my practice, and my friends looked at me like I was insane. And they said, well, why are you even doing that? And I would say, well, how long do you sit doing your billing? And they would say, oh, it takes like 1 day a month. And I would say, well, I can do it in 5 minutes. I said, my biggest problem in 1990 was I hated folding the bills, just to stick them in an envelope. So they would look at me like, well, that's great, but I don't need that. And then, of course, over time, that became something that everyone did. And then I did electronic billing, where I didn't even do the billing. I just kind of hit the button and it was done. And my friends went, oh, I don't need that. But eventually that became the standard. And then actually in 1989, a prospective patient called me up and said they'd like to be seen by me, but they wanted my resume. And I'm thinking, that's unusual. And my immediate gut was, if you want my resume, you and I are not going to work out very well. So, but I thought at that time, I had dial-up internet access, where you dialed up and it made all those noises and it was very slow. But it was $19.99 for dial-up access a month. But for another $5, you could have a website. And so I decided I could have a website for $5. And I could have told this guy, okay, look me up, you're on the internet. And so I had Microsoft Publisher 98 had a module that you could do a website on. So I created a website using Microsoft Publisher 98. And I had, at the time I had like, web name addresses. And so I actually owned Psychologists R Us. I thought, that should work out. I just had it in abeyance. I didn't really use it. And I also have psychologist.li, which I do use. Now, I happen to be on Long Island, And people on Long Island think that stands for Long Island, but it's actually Lithuania. And so that was just another example of me expanding, technology. And so, and then in 2002, 2003, I decided, podcasts would be a good idea. And so I started doing podcasts around 2005. And they were really silly in the beginning. It was like me talking about how people really couldn't tell the difference between Pepsi and Coke, or why cigarette smoking actually reduces IQ. And so I would do all these little, funny little, psychological podcasts. And then eventually decided, maybe people don't want to hear me anymore. And so I got guests. And then I convinced the local psychological association and the New York State Psychological Association to have podcasts. And I was their host. And so I did their podcasts, I did their video casts. And I was just always one step ahead, I think, of where everyone else was. And then in 2013, I got a board certification in telemental health. And again, my friends looked at me like, what's wrong with you? What do you need that for? And I said, you'll see. It'll be beneficial. You'll see. And of course, the pandemic hit. And all of my friends are now using teletherapy, and they never used it before. I have to, my generation, actually, I'm going to be 74 at the end of this month. So if you have to look at, my peers, my cohorts, we're ancient. And so I'm kind of an outlier in that respect. So how does this wind up getting into VR? So I always thought that was going to be like the greatest thing in the world. And I started looking at it around 2000 when I came across Skip Rizzo's work. Mm-hmm. And he was doing work with virtual classrooms in the determination of ADHD and the treatment of ADHD. And I thought that was great. It's much better than doing, tests on paper and, rating forms. It would be actual experience and actual data. But he already sold it. So I couldn't get into that. And then around 2013 or 2008 or so, I decided I was going to do public speaking anxiety for executives. And I was going to go to them. I wanted it to be portable. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to have them come to me. I could go to their office, work in their privacy of their own office. And but there was nothing out there that could do that. And then I came across Sios, mm-hmm. which became Amelia, which ultimately became XR Health. But I started with them, and that was the first time that you could use a Samsung Gear headset with a phone, and it was therefore accessible to almost anybody. And it was accessible as a clinician because now it became affordable. Right. Because before that, it could cost, $200,000-$300,000 for a setup of some sort, which also had terrible visualization and it was heavy and clumsy. So by using the Samsung Gear VR and using a cell phone, now I'm portable. And that was great. And then the pandemic hit, and now they converted their application so that it was now remote. You could use it for remote population. I could control their Samsung Gear in their home or their cell phone. It didn't matter what it was. And that was great. So I've kind of been with them all these years. And I am, I guess on some level, the ambassador for XR Health. So I still use their product line. And now they actually came out with a DME version. So it's a durable medical equipment. And now it's covered by insurance. So Medicare covers the headset, and maybe secondaries will eventually follow suit. Mm-hmm. But that's one kind of mindset we're using the system to now distribute headsets. Unfortunately, only Medicare is covering it at this point, but we'll see what happens. So the thing that you talked about earlier about my trying to get people together, and the reason that was an issue is because it's a very disjointed community, and everyone is doing their own thing, but there's just not a sense of community in terms of supporting one another, helping one another, even the idea of coming up with ways of credentialing VR therapists. We don't have that, and so I decided after I would get calls from all over the country for VR therapy. And of course, I'm only licensed in New York and in Florida, but I couldn't service all these people. And I would go online for them, and I would say, okay, listen, give me a day. I'll find somebody who's near you who uses VR in their treatment process. And I couldn't find anybody. Half the time, I came up empty. No, yes, you're in my directory, but there are 73 people or so in my directory after all these years. And I know that there are many, many more people who are doing VR therapy, and either they don't want to step up to the plate, or they're insecure about their abilities, or whatever the reason, they don't really kind of step up and say, I'm over here. So if you go online, you don't find too many people who are providing VR therapy in Oklahoma.
So there are people who are going to be listening to this who maybe are thinking either, well, that's the kind of treatment I would like to have. And so here's a list. And so we will definitely put in all your information with the podcast so that they can find that. And then the other piece is that there will probably be clinicians who are saying, like me, raise your hand, that they are providing these services. What would be the mechanism? Are you looking to grow your list? And would you want those people to reach out with the information we provide with the podcast? Is that something you're looking for?
Absolutely. I want this directory to be useful.
Yes.
And what I really wanted was, I wanted the general public to be able to find a clinician who does VR.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted clinicians to be able to cross-refer. I wanted a place, because if I go on the site and I go, oh, I need somebody in Idaho, whatever, or Chicago, I could now give that person the name of somebody who does VR. So that's really, yeah.
I'm sorry. The other piece to that is that both for psychologists and even now for certain types of master's level therapists, we have PsyPact and we have the counseling compact for people. Unfortunately, you're in New York and they haven't approved it yet. So it's coming, it's in the legislation. So hopefully by the time this airs, it'll be there. But what PsyPact allows is, if you jump through all the hoops and you check off all the boxes and you're in a state, your home state is a state that is approved for PsyPact, then you can see people in all of the states under that. And it's 40 something states now. So you also have the ability for that to be expansive too, that even a particular therapist can now see people from where they are, all over the country, as long as it's a PsyPact state. So I think it broadens even more the people that you're bringing together for resources.
Yeah, it does. And I also think the ability to do this remotely is a great asset. Mm-hmm. And, that's not the way it was originally, but the ability to handle patients remotely is a boon to this kind of technology. And I think that, there are probably people listening to this maybe who don't know VR or don't know the benefit, I think, of VR. I don't know what your audience is or where this, hits, but I think that, one of the things that I've learned, I tend to use VR primarily for phobias and anxieties. That's where I'm comfortable. And I think that's where most of the research really lies. Um, and so what I find is that when patients are into using the system correctly, they get, I could see patients for less than 9 sessions, 10 sessions.
I
Uh,
just listened to a podcast you did with Dr. Walter Greenleaf.
mhm.
Listened to that last week, and I think the world of Walter. I think he's done amazing work, and it was so great to hear you all discussing that. And that's one of the things I heard you speaking about too is the length of treatment in the way that you work with your clients. That the length of treatment, it seems like it's drastically reduced,
Yes.
given the approach that you are utilizing.
Yeah, it clearly works very efficiently. And I think that, I guess it's a pro and a con. The pro is it works very well for patients. The con, as a clinician, it means you need a high turnover rate.
Hmm.
And so many clinicians, and I said this at Walter's, many clinicians have patients for 20, 30 years. And so, their practice is very stable. I see the same person. They come in every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, boom, 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 whatever. But when you're working with VR, after 8 or 9 sessions, they're done. And that means, you don't have that kind of like stability in your practice, and you have to kind of promote yourself, which is one of the few things that clinicians don't do.
Mhm.
So, we're not trained to market ourselves. We're not trained to go out and promote ourselves. And so, since we're not business people, we don't understand the concept of, you know, uh, marketing. And I think that that's one of the downsides, I think, of VR is that, not too many people know it exists, or they don't understand that it's just not all gaming.
Well, that's why we're here. That is absolutely what our group, our Mental Health Virtual Reality International Coalition, is here for. That's why I started it, and we're writing things and talking to amazing people like you who have been in this. Not everybody's been in it a long time, but we're talking with you. We've talked with Skip. There's a number of people. We've talked with Elizabeth McMahon, people who have been in the field and doing this work with the amazing foresight. I mean, you just gave us a number of examples of where you were like, "Ooh, I saw this. I saw the need and the opportunity, and I went for it." And my friends were like, "You're crazy." And then it happened a number of times. I would think by this point your friends would be like, "Oh, maybe he's onto something," because each time we've kind of caught up
Yeah.
later in it. And I would say that in the conversations that we've had, and certainly my experience clinically, is that the length of treatment, it depends. I think it's true whether you're using VR or not, but the length of treatment also depends on the therapeutic goals and your
Mhm.
approach. And, there are a lot of components. It can be in the work that I do, I integrate it into the work we're doing it as a whole. It's part of, if it's appropriate for whatever our therapeutic
Right.
goal is at the time, then that's what I incorporate in. But I think it's important for us to talk about different ways that it can be utilized, and with specific, what I'm hearing from you, and absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, but with the approach that you have and the specific therapeutic goals that you have, to be able to take leverage and really capitalize on the amazing components of VR therapy that allows the I'm sure the immersion and the embodiment and the multisensory experiences and all of those components plus more bring you to be able to have them have the experiences necessary to meet the treatment goals in a shorter amount of time. And that makes absolute sense to me.
Yeah. And I do think it's in a sense on some level personality based in terms of the clinician. So I'm very directive, And I basically believe that I know more in certain areas than the patient does, but also I know the patient knows more than I do because they know more about themselves than I do. But I think that therapy, from my perspective, is really a combination of working with the patient, being present for the patient, being supportive, educating the patient, and then getting the patient to recognize their contributions and what's happening to them. So for me, VR therapy is really, CBT, mindfulness, a mind-body connection, and psychoeducation, all kind of like thrown in together, so that the patient really becomes armed and has agency in their own life, rather than feeling like they're being pulled along down the river where they have no controls. And so by giving them back the control and understanding, they have that sense of comfort in their own skin, and that comes pretty fast. And I've had patients who would come to me and say, well, I was with Dr. So-and-so, and in the first session I was with you, I learned more than I learned in 2 years with Dr. So-and-so. And I would say, well, why is that the case? Well, they say, well, Dr. So-and-so hardly said anything. And so, they just kind of like had some kind of, I guess, Rogerian client-centered approach. And I personally am a Rogerian failure. I was trained in Rogers, and when they train you, you sit there and somebody is actually sitting in the room with you. They're rating you. They're not rating the patient. And it's like on a 2 to 10 scale in terms of your response. And I was always on the wrong end, because I just couldn't sit there and go, okay, yeah, I get it. Now, how am I going to respond to that without helping you, understand that better? So I learned that that's just not me. But I think that depending upon the patient and what they need, I think that the personality of the therapist is very important. And that relationship is very important. And I think that's another thing, by the way, that people who look at VR think, oh, VR gets in the way of the relationship between you and the patient. And that's not the case at all. I think VR doesn't get in the way because it's still just part of the treatment. It's not the whole treatment. The patient isn't in this virtual environment the entire time, and you're kind of like doing nothing. I'm pretty involved. And I know, Elizabeth McMahon and I had this conversation where we would say, some clinicians think you're not supposed to talk. You're not supposed to be directive while the person's in VR. And both of us go, no, you could talk.
Absolutely. Yeah. What do you think it is about the immersive environment, the immersive technologies that sets this apart? I feel like there are things that we can take from traditional that bridge over concepts and fundamentals, that we can say, oh, we would look at or think about or address in the traditional, and we can do that in the VR as well. But there are also some things that are unique to it. What do you think in your experience, your conceptualization is unique about VR?
VR does a couple of things. First of all, it eliminates the need, I think, for the patients to kind of have to create imagery, to have to use their efforts and energy in trying to hold on to an image that's in front of them, because VR does that for you. I think that there's a uniqueness to VR that allows patients to kind of like flow with it, because there is a kind of like playfulness component to it, and so they feel more comfortable. And I also think, lastly, VR is as close as we're going to get to in vivo without putting someone in such a threatening situation that they can't get out of it. So, when in the old days, when you'd have to drive with patients, or you had to send them out to drive or go on an airplane, there were clinicians who would actually take airplane trips with patients, but how time consuming and costly is that? And by doing that same thing in VR, we get the same physiological response from a patient, but I could have a patient go up and down 4 or 5 times in a session, takeoff and landings, whatever. It increases the ability of the exposures that I can't do in real life.
And the control you can have over the environment too, and the experience. If you go up in an elevator with somebody, you're going to have to come down in some way, or the elevator, or some way. Whereas in VR, you have much more control over what the experience that person is going to actually have, and hopefully, therefore, tailoring it to the needs that they have. I was on a panel in 2019 with Dr. Les Posen, and he talked quite a bit about the days before VR and chartering a plane, the expense and the time and all of the things of working through all of that with somebody on a chartered plane. And now we can get into VR. It's a much different experience in terms of time and cost, but not in terms of the physiological response like you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I cut off Adam, and I'm sorry. I'll let you finally chime in because I'm taking up all the space with Dr. Gurr. I'm sorry.
Well, if you're playing our drinking game, then
I know.
that's
we had a joke in our meeting this week that we could have a drinking game with certain things that came up in the podcast, and I said that one of those is me saying I'll stop talking so Adam can. Oh. So that's what he's referring to. So
no, I love this conversation because when we break down like the benefits of VR and how it works, and it just makes me think of other modalities that might have been questioned, where we're really just getting at how are we reaching the client, how are we working with them. And I use both horror media in my practice because I've got like a lot of clients who love horror and the metaphors, and I do geek therapy as well. And it's all just using the client interests to connect them to whatever it is we're working on. And horror does a similar thing where they can face their fears in a safe environment without having to like walk down a dark alleyway and hope they make it to their car. But VR really kind of does, other than like the technical, like maybe the tech part of it that scares maybe clinicians away. Really, if we break it down, it's not that much different than other methods that we've done, like riding an airplane. We're just not physically on the airplane.
I think the problem is that clinicians are comfortable with what they're trained in. And there isn't enough training in clinical schools, graduate schools, in VR. So people are getting out of programs and having no knowledge of anything other than their background and training, and asking them to step into something new is scary. And I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that most clinicians aren't even aware, I think, still at this point, about the benefits of VR.
Yeah.
So
I have emails all the time from students who are asking me questions, and then they say they go to their professor, or they already have, and the professor either knows nothing about it or is saying, no, that's not okay. And so they're writing to me saying, I'm getting this feedback, and yet you're doing this work and other people are doing this work. And, then I send them some articles and some resources and hope that they can then explore it on their own. And I have, for the last, 6 or 7 years, maybe, provided a series of sessions of trainings for therapists. Isn't that how we met, Adam?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how we met.
I do. I took one of your trainings.
Yeah. And to help clinicians with their comfort and their capability, and competence in using VR in therapy. And I don't see a whole lot of that out there either. So as you were talking earlier, I'm like, maybe you and I should talk about joining forces, Howard, and seeing if we can come up with some way to get this out there even more, because you've been at that for a really long time. And there are people who are passionate, and then there are people who have no idea, and then there are those people in the middle who aren't sure what to do with it.
Yeah, and
Something.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I was just going to tag real quick that I've had this conversation with some of my peers of I like to teach, but I'm more of a theoretical person. I've always liked those classes where you can fold in different topics with different ideas. But part of the counseling, my experience as a student in counseling, the CACREP accreditation part was so lockstep. It was hard to get other things in that may not have been approved. Which I always kind of saw as a problem in the educational part is there's a lot of stuff happening that we find out afterwards. Something I say about geek therapy is grad school gave me permission to be a counselor. Geek therapy gave me permission to be the counselor I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of forgot grad school.
Yeah, because I think grad school teaches you, again, the basics. But I don't think, as a clinician, I don't think you really feel like you know what you're doing for at least another 5 years after graduate school. And I think that you do have to find your place and where you shine, and where your skills are maximized, and that's just growth. But I think VR is just one of those technological areas that either people are comfortable in or they're not. And lots of people who are in the clinical field are not tech oriented, and so they just don't see it as the place where they should go because they're just not comfortable with it. But I also think there's just not enough training out there. And I also think that we're still on some levels, in the wild, wild west of XR and virtual reality. And things are changing drastically, very quickly. So, when I first started, there was only maybe one or two major companies out there. And I know Walter and I have been comparing notes. He keeps track of all of the companies that are involved in VR, whether they're medical or not. And I think he's up to about 400 or 500 companies. Mm-hmm. And I keep track of all the companies that are behaviorally oriented, and I'm up to 117. And that's worldwide. And a lot of them are startups, and they're going to either disappear or merge or whatever happens to them. But that's the field, and the field is changing drastically. And there are all sorts of new technologies that are coming out. That, ways to measure emotionality through looking at the eyes or skin, and while you're wearing the headset, or all sorts of other technological advances to make the measurement of emotions and what our patients are going through more accurate and efficient. Because when you're doing subjective units of distress, it's not that accurate, because people tend to either underplay or overplay how they're feeling. And so, when you're dealing with somebody face to face, you can use heart rate variability, and which I think is pretty accurate. But when you're doing it remotely, like I do, I have to rely on people telling me where they are. Mm-hmm. But I think that the field is just growing, and the more we do this, and the more we educate people, and the more clinicians get exposed to the technology that we're talking about, I think we're going to see more adoption.
How do you see it coming together? One of the reasons I started this group was because I literally put a Facebook post, not Facebook, LinkedIn post out and said, I'm feeling like I'm here in the middle of nowhere doing this thing, and I know there are other people out here doing this thing. Like, can we come together? And that's how this was even born many years ago. And I was thinking about how fragmented it felt, and used the word disjointed. And so then started to find people, and and connecting, and commonalities and differences, all the things. We also have so many different headsets and different programs, different approaches, to like philosophically of what's being included and what's not, where the money and the funding is going, what's being developed, how the things are being developed are being informed. For a while, I was a chief psychology officer for a VR company, and that company was very obviously they sought out a person for that role, and so they were very focused on what's the psychology in all of this and informing the experiences and the neurobiology and all that kind of stuff. And then you have companies who don't look at that at all. How do you, since you have proven yourself a worthy person who can see what's coming over these decades, how do you see this coming together? If you do, maybe you're going to say I don't, but hopefully you do. How do you see it coming together in the future?
Well, I do see it coming together. I do think that there are going to be a couple of key players. Like in any industry, you have your industry leaders, and then you have the people who are in the middle, and then you have companies that just don't cut it for whatever reason. Um, in this situation, I think funding is a real problem. But I think that when you take a look at where we started and where things are going now, there's a lot of technology that is now being incorporated that wasn't there before. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of AI involvement and incorporation in VR, and that's important because as a clinician, I need to be able to individualize the virtual environments because not everyone has the same issue, and so you can't use a kind of generic virtual environment for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have AI components. We're having a lot of technological advancements in, as I said before, sensory monitoring and measuring people's emotional reactions and responses. So I think that when all of these technologies become, consistently able to work and communicate with one another, and clinicians are comfortable in using these situations in such a way that they could, individualize treatment. I think that's where we're going to go, and I think that we're probably, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, down the road where things are going to congeal and it's all going to come together, and we're going to have a package that is really useful and capable of handling more than just, let's say, anxieties or phobias. So, there's so many different angles that companies are going for: pain management and, cognitive difficulties and autistic children and PTSD. I mean, it's just all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at this point, like XR's model is very comprehensive, and that's really what their approach is, because their system is PT, OT, cognitive, behavioral. It's all on one platform.
Mm-hmm.
That I think is kind of the direction that people are going to go. Unfortunately, on some level, that's very expensive for clinicians to utilize. So I don't think that the solo practitioner is going to be able to afford that kind of package, but systems will, hospitals will, because then their staff only has to learn one system. So,
but for the individual clinician with different trainings and different trainings, they can learn how to maybe do some of that on their own, which I think is what we're all doing in many ways. What's the better headset, what programs are out there, what resonates with our clients.
Mm-hmm.
I remember looking into Amelia back in the day. There was another company too, PsyOp, I think was their name.
so
And I remember thinking,
VR,
like, it was, which one?
SciTech VR.
Yes. And I remember thinking how cool it all was, and that I could see the potential, but also like, oh, I can't justify the cost right now because But I could also see like maybe one insurance payment could cover the monthly fee or whatever it was, but you have to build that up. So there's that cost
Yeah,
period in
I
between.
think, listen, if you had a package, a VR package that costs, let's say, $1,200 to $1,500 a year, the subscription, that's the whole
Mm.
package. That's doable.
Yeah.
If you, if you use VR maybe as a premium service, and you charge maybe at a higher rate for a premium service, um, you can make that up pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that, um, if you look at, it goes back to the business model. All right.
Mm.
We're not business people. We don't understand return on investment. We don't understand that, you have to spend money to make money on some level. But, when you look at most clinicians, they get a business card printed up. Maybe they don't even use business cards anymore. Um, they have a telephone number. They rent some space. I'm in business. And they figure everyone's going to come, but of course they're not. But that's what they think. And so, but if you had to like do testing, let's say, I don't know, what does a whisk cost these days? Um, it's not cheap.
The actual test itself? Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's an investment.
yeah, it's an investment. Of course, you're going to make that investment back, but it's an investment. And
Mm.
so you have a practice where you have like all of these tests that you have to buy. It's costly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. But I think that, you can get that money back if you know, don't do insurance testing. But, I mean, here on Long Island, if you're going to do a neuropsych assessment, it's probably going to be about $6,000 or $7,000.
Mm-hmm.
A forensic assessment's $11,000 here. So, yeah, all right. So you invest in those things, you'll get your money back.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to look at VR as the same thing. You invest your money in VR, you got to get your money back. The problem becomes VR patients. How do you get them?
Right.
You
Well,
know?
there's that threshold. There's a threshold in the business part of it, which is how much money obviously is going out and how much is coming in, and how do you meet that with the clients, who are utilizing it, and then you bring in the in some cases being able to bill insurance, as you were talking earlier, and you and Walter talked about a bit in your conversation. Then there's also the clinician portion of it, the theoretical foundation, the approach to your
Mm.
work, all of that kind of stuff. And there's a threshold somewhere in there of the value. I hear a lot of clinicians say, "Oh, but I can do that in the traditional," and it's like there there are different things here, but they need to have the experience. They need to have the
Mm.
training, the experience. I remember even the first time uh, my my husband and I have a company, Virtual Sand Tray, and we have it in iOS and we also have it for VR. And he was telling me about skyboxes. So basically, for people who don't know what that word means, it's the when you look up in the sky, it's the view that you have all around you. And he was saying how he was putting in different skyboxes, and in my head, I just couldn't. Even though I was familiar with VR, I was all in all the things. I couldn't wrap my head around it until I put the headset on, and then he changed the skyboxes, and I was like, oh, because it changed the whole mood. It
Mm.
changed the experience completely. And so I don't think that people necessarily understand the value until they have the experience and the education, and then tying that together with the work that they do, and then realizing it brings things to a whole new level. So there are multiple thresholds that end up happening across the board. And if people don't have either the access or the ability to check it all out, in even on their own, never mind in their practice, I think it ends up not happening. So
Yeah.
part of it is exposure, as we're
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah, and I think it's my experience is that you can tell everybody or anybody about virtual reality, but they have to experience it to
Yeah.
recognize, the impact. And I think that was my experience very early on in the beginning, where SIOS sent one of their um, account guys to me to show me the platform, and he went through all of the virtual environments, and I felt like nothing. And
Hmm.
I'm thinking, maybe this isn't ready for prime time yet. And he said, wait, one more thing. So he put me on the edge of a balcony, the virtual balcony, and said, okay, take a step. And I actually said, no, I don't think so. I knew where I was.
Hmm.
Cognitively, I was in my office, but my brain would not let me take that step. And I went, okay, I get it.
Yep. Yeah.
That's one way I explain it to people is it doesn't take much to trick our brain. And one of the nice, interesting things about VR, and Morgan Spurlock did a documentary, and I remember him being on a plank of wood, and they like recreated. This is how I remember it, so it could be a false memory, but um, they recreated the room he was in virtually, and so when he stepped on that plank of wood, the floor fell out from under him, and he lost his balance and like grabbed that plank of wood to keep his balance. And I always remember thinking, even though he knows he's in the room, his brain couldn't quite make sense of it.
Did you ever play with Richie's plank?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
same
I
thing.
don't like it.
Yeah. Right.
It's very
I can't.
powerful.
Right. I can't step off the port.
Mm-mm. Nope.
I could go on the port, but I can't step off.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So
No.
yeah, that's like as Les Posen calls that, the low lying fruit of VR.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I think it's so powerful. And the interesting thing for me is that a third of my practice is actually, I keep moving and I get blurry from this camera here. Um, uh, a third of my practice is actually patients of other clinicians who were in therapy, and as part of the process of therapy, patients said, oh, by the way, I have to travel in 6 weeks on a plane. I've been on a plane 20 years. And then the clinician would say, oh, well, I'm not going to get you there, but Dr. Gurr can. And so then they would transfer the patient to me for like 6 weeks,
Yep.
work on that, focus on that, and then send it back, and they would go on their trip.
Yeah. It's
So
fantastic.
it's so fast and so efficient. I can't say that enough, because clinically, I think that I think we should all be using it because it works so well.
When we're starting to run out of time, and I'm trying to filter out the questions because I could just keep talking to you for hours. Um, One of the things I like to ask people is there anything that you speak to a lot of people, you've written things, you do your podcast, you've been doing it for a long time. Um, is there anything that you feel like you haven't been able to share or talk about or let people know about? I would love to give you the opportunity for that.
Hmm. I can't think of anything. Um, I just believe as a field we need to be more um, adventurous in a sense. We're very. I find us very conservative and cautious, and I think we need to be a little bit bolder, and we need to be out there, and we need to be talking about what we do as psychologists,
Mhm.
and what makes us different than, let's say, other clinicians, or what makes us stand out in helping people. I just think that we're too laid back, and I think that we need to step out in the public's eye
Mhm.
and make statements that are important. and stand up for the rights of people who need our support. And they're just, there's just not enough of that. So I just think that, as I am a person who doesn't shut up, I think that that's really what we need. We need to be out there and market and tell the world who we are and what we can do for them.
And the power within.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And we need people with voices like yours to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's my goal.
Yes. Have the conversations, do the work, inform the development, educate people, bring them together. And those are things that I see that you've been working on and toward and in throughout your career. And so I really want to say thank you for that. And hopefully this podcast will bring you to even other people, because, each time we all connect, we bring the people who are connected to us, and then hopefully that'll bring more together. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's like a Wayne's World. You tell your 3 friends, I'll tell 3 friends, they tell 3 friends.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
That's the way it should be.
Yes.
Right. And I think that that's the way this is going to work.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
How can people reach you? How can people, if they're interested in learning more about you, finding you, what's the best way to kind of reach out?
I suppose my website, so it's www.drsgurr.com. They could go to the virtual reality, the directory. It's vrttherapists.com or vrtherapistinternational.com. Or they could go find my podcast, The Shrink Is In. So, and not to be confused with the movie The Shrink Is In, by the way.
Who had it first? I'm going to guess you.
No.
You didn't have the name for your podcast before the movie?
No, I didn't. I made the name up, and then I was just working on it because I thought it was kind of funny. And then at one point I looked it up and I realized, there's a movie called The Shrink Is In. So.
Well, you came up with something great. So that's great. We'll put the information in writing for people too, but it's good to also hear it and for people to seek you out. Check out the list that you have. Hopefully some people will actually add their names to that as well. And
please do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, Jessica, Adam, great talking to you.
Same.
Thank you so much for talking with us, for providing your story, your voice, and to everyone listening. Thank you for joining us. And until next time.
Thank you.
This episode was brought to you by MHVR in partnership with the American Medical Extended Reality Association.